Just as a reminder, what we're doing with these short teaching videos is helping you, hopefully, be able to share more naturally your life in Christ, your relationship with Jesus, with your friends, family, co-workers. And so I did one little teaching on how to retell the stories Jesus told. Then I did a little video clip, last one, on how to tell in story form the teachings of Jesus, which I think is a bit of a challenge because we tend to take his teachings and we make them into doctrine and theology and give them 1, 2, 3, 4 points and kind of teach them in a linear, very logical Western way. Whereas I think we can do it more like Jesus did it, in context, tell their teachings, but they're in story form. And this one I want to focus on telling and retelling stories of the life of Jesus. If I asked you, tell me 10 really cool, no, not 10, 2 really cool things about the life of Jesus. Not his parables, not what he said and not what he taught, but about his life. It could be a challenge. I challenge people with that a lot when I speak. You know, what are the 3 or 4 favorite things Jesus did? Not what he said, but that he did. And people kind of go, what he did, let's see, what he did. It was interesting, a few years ago, I was challenged by a friend with this thought that he had, and he hadn't researched it, so I did. And I went back and looked at 30 of the great Christian creeds, starting with the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, all the way through to modern evangelical Western creeds of the Christian faith. And I looked at them for one thing. Was there any content in these creeds about the life of Jesus? Now, I don't know if you'll believe this or not, so feel free, go back and look yourself. You can probably type in Christian creeds in Google, and find them, a whole bunch of them. There is nothing about the life of Jesus in the creeds of the Christian faith. Isn't that interesting? They almost always do something like he was born of a virgin, and they might say, and he lived, or maybe 1 or 2 say he lived a sinless life, and then died, rose again, and then it goes on. It skips the 33-ish years of his life. And particularly 3 years of his life is well documented. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are 4 books in the Bible that specifically document much of what he did. Obviously not all of what he did, but much of what he did for 3 years. But we just tend to skim right through that. I think that has profound effect on how we then share our faith in Jesus, because then we boil it down to theology. He was born of a virgin. We kind of have in the back of our mind the creeds of the faith, and so we say things like he was born of a virgin and then he died. And we like to get very quickly to the death and resurrection because we know there is power in the cross. The cross and his death and his resurrection are a beautiful thing. It's not a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing. However, in that hurry to get to the cross, we tend to forget that he lived a life. And he didn't just teach things and say little, he didn't travel around in out-of-body experience and then give out little profound statements that we can then preach from. He lived. He lived a real actual life. What was his life like? How did he live? How did he interact with the disciples? It's interesting that he was always walking places. He didn't seem to ride horses. It wasn't riding around in a chariot. He walked everywhere. And as he walked with his disciples, not just the 12, but there was usually 20, 25, 30 people that followed him around all the time. And then it seemed to grow to 70 and even 120 and several hundred. And then wherever he went, he quickly drew a crowd. But it's interesting that he taught as he went. I think, again, today we have it backwards. We tend to teach in settings, churches, or universities, and then we hope people go out and do it. What Jesus did is he lived his life. He was doing what he was teaching. And then he kind of said, by the way, did you guys notice what I just did there? And you can do the same thing. Jesus was amazing about doing it and then telling the disciples that they can do it and then doing it with the disciples and then telling the disciples, bye-bye, I'm out of here, you're on. And we often have it exactly backwards. I like to say maybe it's not fair to say, but whenever we find ourselves doing the exact opposite of what Jesus did, one of the two of us is probably wrong. Right? And so I think many times in how we teach and how we think of learning, how we think about being a disciple of Jesus, being a student or mentees of Jesus, the great mentor, we have to look at his life, how he did things, how he taught, how he thought, how he worked and walked with the 12, the 25, the 72, 120. Think about, let's just take one. Let me just think of one right now. Remember when he was called by Jairus, the Roman ruler, to come heal his daughter? And Jesus said, yes, he would do that. And do you remember he got interrupted on the way? Do you remember the story? He was walking with a crowd of people pressing in around him, and then he says, wait a minute, somebody touched me. And the disciples, as the disciples often do, they're like, whatever, Jesus. It was just so funny to see the disciples kind of sometimes rebuking Jesus, whether he wanted to stop and heal a blind man, and they said, don't waste your time, or in this case, what do you mean somebody touched you? Everybody around you is touching you. They said, no, I felt like, power going out of me. And then, there was a woman who seemed to touch just the edge of his dress, kind of the robe that he was probably wearing. And she was healed. And then he stops and he spends time with her and he talks with her and interacts with her. I wonder, I've often thought this, were the disciples saying to him, Jesus, do you realize there's an important Roman official who's asked you to go heal his daughter who's about to die, and you're spending time with this lady? It's an interruption. But Jesus' timing was always right. Even though the servant came back and said, never mind the master, because the daughter's dead. And I'm sure the disciples said, yep, there you go. Once again, Jesus stopping for blind people and beggars and sick people and lepers and women that are bleeding, and what's up with this? And yeah, Jesus says, it's okay. We'll still go. And then the story went. She was dead, in fact, but death to Jesus doesn't really matter, so he raises her back to life. I love the fact that Jesus never seemed to mind being interrupted or being late. Lazarus as well, some of his favorite people, Mary and Martha were just, like, Jesus, you got to hurry. He's about to die. And then he died. And then he still didn't seem to be rushed. Didn't seem to bother him. He got there late. He was, in fact, by our standards, late. But is Jesus ever actually late? Doesn't seem like it. I love to look, and I would challenge you to look and then re-look, maybe again and again and again at the Gospels, looking at how Jesus actually did things. Not just what he said, not just his parables, not just the end game, not just that he died and rose again, and not the theology around it, but look at how he lived, how he interacted, how he questioned the questioner, how he didn't answer questions, how he seemed to avoid certain topics and focus on others, how he dealt with the religious people compared to the sinners, how he dealt with his closest disciples, how it was kind of hard sometimes on Peter, James, and John. He was a little nicer to the other 9. He was a little bit nicer. Kind of as you get further and further out, he seemed to be nicer to the ones that are on the outside, a little bit harder on the ones on the inside. The religious people especially, I call them the religious right of his day, who thought they were in fact right. And he was really hard on them. Again, do we do it that way? Or do we have it backwards? I wonder if we're actually really nice to ourselves. Like if you're in the club, part of the church, part of the deal, we're nice to each other. The other ones are the ones on the outside, the ones that don't look like us, that don't dress like us, that don't think like us. We're kind of hard on them. And then they feel that judgment, and then they don't come in. So who has it wrong? Is it us or is it Jesus?